So I've been practicing the Wim Hof Method for a few years now. I've done a handful of workshops. I've done expeditions with Wim. I've read all the books I can get my hands on, all the scientific papers I can find, and nowhere have I found a good explanation for why the Wim Hof Method combines breathwork and cold exposure. It's a question I've had for a long time, and now that I'm starting to lead workshops, a lot of people are asking me the same thing, and I want to give you the answer to that question today. In very simple terms, they're two complementary strategies. You're working on two ends of the same spectrum, and that spectrum is creating stress and then alleviating that stress as rapidly and as effectively as possible through a very specific mechanism, which is the mammalian dive reflex or the mammalian dive response. And this explanation, just to be clear, it's not the official inner fire explanation. It's something I've come up with on my own, but it makes a lot of sense. And I especially like it because it puts the focus on where I think it should be, which is on not just on our physiological processes, but on their psychological consequences, right? For me, the Wim Hof Method is primarily a psychological tool. That's where I think it's the most valuable, the most interesting, and the most unique. The way I understand psychology is that it's context dependent. You know, it's dependent on the environment in which that mind exists. So that could be the external environment, like the place where we live, where we work, our relationships, all that kind of thing. But it's also our internal environment, our physiology and our neurology. And both of these two ends of the spectrum really have an incredibly powerful impact on the way our psychology functions. And I think the Wim Hof Method is most powerful as a psychological tool because it changes our physiology. It changes the context in which our mind functions.
So maybe the quickest way to explain this is that it recalibrates our stress response and increases our ability on a physiological level to respond productively to stressors in our lives. This has very little to do with goal setting, with determination, with any conscious brain activity whatsoever, and has much more to do with the physiological underpinnings behind that, which I think are best described by looking at the mammalian dive response. This was first discovered, in humans at least, by Jacques Mayol, a French freediver who famously called it our inner dolphin. Like Wim, he often pushed far past the limits of what medical scientists believe was possible, showing once again that science may do a fine job of describing processes observed within our bodies, but is often inadequate to predict what we are capable of achieving. And like Wim, Jacques often spoke in what may seem like strange or even mystical language, but his claims were later backed up by rigorous investigation, and are now part of the canon of standard medical knowledge.
Il y a une espèce de résonance, si vous voulez, entre le dauphin et l'homme. Le dauphin, lui, n'est pas un poisson. Lorsqu'il va sous l'eau, il fait comme vous et moi, il fait de l'apnée, il retient son souffle, il respire, fait une inspiration avant de pénétrer le milieu marin et retient son souffle.
So to get to the specifics, the mammalian dive response it's a set of responses that all mammals have, humans included. It's really not that complex in physiological terms. It's basically a set of responses that we have that enable us to stay in the water as long as possible. So anytime we hold our breath or we get into water, and even more so if we get into cold water, our heart rate drops, we have vasoconstriction, so the blood stays in our vital organs, our body becomes more efficient at using oxygen, and there's a whole sort of series of other responses that happen when we get into greater depth. But basically the point is our body goes into an almost sort of Zen state of relaxation. It's to optimize its energy efficiency and be able to stay in the water as long as possible. And both with the breath work and with the cold exposure, we're activating that set of responses very effectively and very, very efficiently. And so they're sort of complementary tools in that way. Right, and it's interesting physiologically, and to note that they're complementary, and doing more breath work will help you stay in the cold water longer, and being in the cold water longer will help you to do longer breath retentions. You know, that's interesting, but to me, it's much deeper than that. And
I sincerely believe that man is somehow related to the diving mammals, who, like us, are warm-blooded and who have to hold their breath to go underwater.
So looking at the cold water, I think this is probably the easiest example, right? So we get into the cold water and we're activating the stress response. We get these really high levels of adrenaline. Our body interprets this as mortal danger. But at the same time, we're also activating the mammalian dive response. We're getting a decreased heart rate. We're getting vasoconstriction. Our body senses that things are safe, and it starts to calm down. and our mind follows our body, right? Our mind starts to calm down as well. And one way to understand the cold exposure is we're changing the physiological signature of stress. We're teaching our body that in what it interprets to be a stressful situation, it can also be relaxed. Yeah? And the same thing happens with the breath work. So when we start to hyperventilate, that's part of the typical physiological signature of stress, right? So our body interprets that as danger. Even if there's no external stimulus that's dangerous, just the mere fact that we're hyperventilating, that stimulates this whole sort of chain reaction of the stress response. And just a quick aside here, the famous Radboud study when Wim and 12 other people got injected with endotoxin and were able to shut down their immune reaction. That was based on the stress response. All they did was hyperventilation for a very long time, got their levels of adrenaline to such a high level that they shut off their immune response, and so didn't react to the endotoxin, right? So that really is the essence of the power of the Wim Hof Method, is this ability to control our stress response and then relax from it. So what we're doing is we're hyperventilating at first. Again, we're activating the physiological signature of stress. Our body interprets that as us being in danger. Our adrenaline levels rise, and we go into our fight or flight response. But at the same time, we're getting rid of all our CO2, which means we're allowed to hold our breath for much longer. So we get these really long breath holds, twice as long as you could otherwise, 5 times as long as you could otherwise. And your body goes into this deep state of relaxation. Again, you're going from extreme stress to extreme relaxation. And you're training the body again and again to stay calm under stress. You're teaching it that it's going to be okay. And our mind follows along behind that. Right? And I think a good way to understand this is a typical treatment for anxiety attacks was just to breathe into a paper bag. And what are you doing there? You're reducing oxygen intake and you're increasing CO2. You're basically simulating a breath hold. The same thing for breathing through a straw, another thing that people say to do. And that dramatically reduces anxiety almost instantly because it activates the mammalian dive reflex. And the same thing with cold water. Here we have the trigeminal nerves, and another common sort of home remedy for an anxiety attack is to splash cold water on your face. Why? Because these receptors are the receptors that activate the mammalian dive reflex. So both with the breath work and with the cold exposure, we're going from this extreme of stress to an extreme of relaxation. And we're reworking that physiological signature, we're reworking our automatic reactions, and we're teaching ourselves to stay calm under stress. And I think it's important to note, because if we make that the focus of our practice, we can go deeper than that. We can go further, right? It's not just an automatic factor. It doesn't have to be. And what I'm really interested in exploring in my personal practice and as an instructor is helping people to go further with those psychological aspects so that we can use them in our everyday lives, right? When stressful occurrences happen, we can have the ability to stay calm, to stay reasonable, and to not let it affect us as deeply as it otherwise would. And I think this is important, not just in day-to-day details, though of course it is, but I think it's important on a very deep sort of structural level, talking about the most important decisions we make in our lives in terms of where we live, what work we do, who we get into relationships with. All of these things are often determined by a stress response, by fear. And if we aren't aware of that and we aren't able to deal with that, we're going to continue making the same sort of unhelpful decisions, you could say, that got us to where we are in the first place. And it's very difficult to break out of that pattern if we aren't aware of what we're doing and we don't have not just the psychological tools, but the physiological tools to change those patterns. So I'll leave that stuff for another video. That's enough for now. If you want to get more of this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, give me, a thumbs up, share with your friends, leave me a comment below, whatever you feel inspired to do. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Until next time.